Economics is not merely mathematics or statistics, it is fundamentally a branch of philosophy. Every economic theory rests upon deeper assumptions about human nature, knowledge, and social organization. My decades at the London School of Economics taught me that the most profound economic insights emerged not from mechanical models, but from careful philosophical reflection on the nature of human knowledge and social coordination. The brilliance of Austrian economics lies precisely in its philosophical foundations, the recognition that individuals act purposefully with limited knowledge, that society is too complex for any mind to comprehend fully, and that order emerges through voluntary interaction rather than central design. Today's economists often forget this philosophical grounding, mistaking technical sophistication for genuine understanding. But the greatest economic questions, how do societies coordinate? Why do some prosper while others stagnate? What role should government play, remain fundamentally philosophical. Understanding the philosophy behind economic thought reveals why certain approaches illuminate truth while others lead to destructive illusions. This intellectual journey will expose the philosophical bedrock that makes Austrian economics not just different, but superior in explaining human action and social cooperation. Chapter 1: The Epistemological Foundation. What can we really know? The starting point of all sound economic thinking must be a proper understanding of the limits of human knowledge. During my early years studying the devastating effects of central planning in post-war Austria, I realized that the fundamental error of socialist economists was not their mathematics, but their epistemology, their theory of what human beings can know. The philosophical tradition from which I emerged, rooted in the Austrian school's methodological individualism, recognizes a crucial distinction that most economists ignore: the difference between scientific knowledge of general principles and the practical knowledge of particular circumstances of time and place. A physicist can discover universal laws that apply everywhere, but an economic planner cannot possess the intimate local knowledge that guides a farmer's decision about when to plant, a shopkeeper's intuition about customer preferences, or an entrepreneur's sense of emerging opportunities. This epistemological insight demolishes the entire intellectual foundation of central planning. The planner's fatal conceit lies in believing that because they can manipulate abstract models, they can orchestrate the actual economy. They confuse knowledge of economic principles with knowledge of particular facts. They mistake theoretical understanding for practical wisdom. Consider the knowledge problem more deeply. Every economic decision requires information that exists only in dispersed fragments across millions of minds. The baker knows his customers' changing tastes. The supplier understands seasonal variations in wheat quality. The transport manager recognizes traffic patterns that affect delivery costs. No central authority can gather this contextual, tacit, constantly changing knowledge. Yet without it, rational economic calculation becomes impossible. The philosophical implications extend far beyond economics. This analysis reveals the fundamental limits of human reason itself. We must approach social problems with epistemic humility, recognizing that our individual knowledge is always fragmentary and provisional. The rationalist tradition that dominated European thought for centuries encouraged the dangerous belief that human reason could master social reality through comprehensive planning. But true wisdom begins with acknowledging the boundaries of what any individual or institution can know. This epistemological foundation shaped my entire approach to economics. It explains why I focused on the discovery function of markets rather than equilibrium states, why I emphasized evolutionary processes rather than rational construction, and why I defended traditional institutions against rationalist reform. The knowledge problem isn't merely a technical challenge, it's the fundamental constraint that shapes all human social organization. Chapter 2: Spontaneous Order, the Philosophy of Emergence. The concept of spontaneous order represents perhaps the most profound philosophical contribution of Austrian economics. It challenges the deepest assumptions of rationalist thought by demonstrating that the most complex and beneficial social arrangements emerge without conscious design. This insight revolutionizes our understanding of social phenomena and reveals the philosophical bankruptcy of constructivist approaches to society. The philosophical tradition I inherited from Carl Menger and developed throughout my career recognizes two fundamentally different types of order. Taxis represents deliberate, designed arrangements, like a military formation or a bureaucratic hierarchy. Cosmos represents emergent order, like language, common law, or market prices. The crucial philosophical point is that cosmos often exhibits greater complexity, adaptability, and functionality than taxis, despite arising without central direction. This philosophical distinction undermines the entire rationalist project in social theory. Since the Enlightenment, intellectuals have assumed that rational design must be superior to unplanned development. They view traditional institutions with suspicion, preferring deliberate reform based on explicit reasoning. But the philosophy of spontaneous order reveals this prejudice as profoundly mistaken. Language illustrates this principle perfectly. No committee designed English grammar, yet it exhibits remarkable complexity and functionality. It adapts continuously to new circumstances, incorporates innovations organically, and coordinates communication among millions of speakers. Attempts to reform language through central planning, like Esperanto or political correctness campaigns, invariably fail because they cannot replicate the evolutionary processes that create linguistic order. The philosophical implications extend to all social institutions. Markets coordinate production and consumption across the globe without central direction. Common law evolves to address new disputes through case-by-case adjudication. Social norms emerge to solve coordination problems without explicit agreement. In each case, the resulting order exhibits properties that no designer could have anticipated or created deliberately. This philosophical understanding transforms our approach to social problems. Instead of asking, how should we design society, we must ask, what conditions allow beneficial order to emerge? This shift from constructivist to evolutionary thinking represents a fundamental philosophical revolution with profound implications for law, politics, and economics. The beauty of spontaneous order lies in its capacity for continuous adaptation and improvement. Unlike designed systems that require conscious modification, spontaneous orders evolve automatically in response to changing circumstances. This evolutionary process ensures that successful practices spread while unsuccessful ones disappear, creating systems of remarkable efficiency and robustness. My work in law, legislation, and liberty explored how this philosophical insight applies to legal and political institutions. The distinction between evolved law and constructed legislation reflects the deeper philosophical divide between organic development and rational design. Understanding this distinction provides the key to preserving and strengthening the foundations of free society. Chapter 3: The Price System as Social Philosophy. The price mechanism represents more than an economic tool, it embodies a profound philosophical solution to the problem of social coordination. Understanding prices philosophically reveals why market economies succeed where planned economies fail and illuminates the deeper principles of voluntary social cooperation. Prices constitute a discovery mechanism for information that exists nowhere else in concentrated form. When I wrote The Use of Knowledge in Society, I was describing not merely an economic process but a philosophical method for aggregating dispersed practical knowledge. Each price reflects countless individual decisions based on local circumstances, personal preferences, and particular insights. The price system performs the epistemological miracle of converting subjective valuations into objective signals that coordinate behavior across vast social networks. Consider the philosophical elegance of this process. A drought in Brazil affects coffee prices in Chicago not through central communication but through voluntary transactions. The Brazilian farmer, facing reduced supply, raises prices to local buyers. These buyers, facing higher costs, adjust their purchasing decisions. Roasters worldwide gradually notice changing market conditions and modify their strategies. Eventually, consumers in America experience slightly higher coffee prices, encouraging conservation and substitution toward other beverages. No central authority orchestrated this coordination, it emerged through millions of voluntary exchanges. This process embodies profound philosophical principles about social organization. It demonstrates how voluntary cooperation can achieve coordination that coercive planning cannot match. It illustrates how subjective individual knowledge can be transformed into objective social information. Most importantly, it reveals how freedom and order are complementary rather than contradictory. The philosophical contrast with central planning could not be starker. Planners must rely on aggregated statistics that strip away the contextual knowledge that makes economic decisions rational. They cannot access the practical wisdom embedded in market prices because they replace the discovery process with administrative fiat. They substitute the planner's limited knowledge for the dispersed wisdom of millions of market participants. Prices also embody a philosophical approach to social justice through voluntary exchange rather than redistributive coercion. Market prices reflect what people are willing to sacrifice to obtain goods and services. This creates a natural harmony between individual choice and social benefit, as people prosper by serving others' needs. The philosophical significance of the price system extends to its role in enabling rational economic calculation. Without market prices for capital goods, producers cannot determine the most efficient allocation of resources. This calculation problem proved fatal to socialist economies, not because of technical difficulties but because of philosophical errors about the nature of economic knowledge. My analysis of the price system reveals its function as humanity's greatest achievement in social cooperation, a mechanism that enables billions of people to coordinate their activities peacefully and productively without central command. This philosophical insight provides the foundation for defending market institutions against political interference and understanding why attempts to improve upon market outcomes through regulation typically make everyone worse off. Chapter 4: The Fatal Conceit, Philosophical Roots of Planning Failures. The persistent appeal of central planning despite its repeated failures reveals deep philosophical errors that plague modern intellectual culture. Understanding these philosophical roots helps explain why brilliant people continue to advocate policies that contradict both theory and evidence. The fatal conceit rests on a fundamental philosophical mistake about the nature of social evolution. Intellectuals tend to apply the methods of natural science to social phenomena, assuming that because we can understand and manipulate physical systems, we can similarly understand and control social systems. This scientific approach ignores the crucial difference between complex social orders and simple mechanical systems. The philosophical tradition of rationalism, stretching from Descartes through the French Enlightenment to modern technocracy, encourages this mistake. Rationalists believe that human reason can comprehend and improve upon any existing arrangement through systematic analysis and deliberate reform. They view traditional institutions with suspicion, preferring conscious design to evolutionary development. This philosophical orientation leads intellectuals to underestimate the wisdom embedded in evolved institutions and overestimate their own capacity for social engineering. They see market outcomes as irrational when they don't conform to their theoretical models. They view traditional practices as backward when they don't follow explicit logical principles. They assume that because they can identify apparent inefficiencies, they can design better systems. The philosophical appeal of planning also stems from moral emotions that evolved for small group cooperation. Humans naturally feel sympathy for visible suffering and desire to help through direct action. This creates psychological pressure to do something about social problems through government intervention, even when such intervention makes problems worse. The moral satisfaction of good intentions overrides careful analysis of actual consequences. Furthermore, the intellectual culture rewards theoretical brilliance over practical wisdom. Academic economists gain prestige by developing elegant models that demonstrate market failures, not by understanding how markets actually coordinate behavior. This creates systematic bias toward interventionist solutions that sound sophisticated but ignore the knowledge and incentive problems that make central planning impossible. The philosophical remedy requires epistemic humility, recognizing the limits of individual knowledge and respecting the wisdom embedded in voluntary institutions that have evolved over time. This doesn't mean accepting all existing arrangements uncritically, but it does mean approaching reform with careful attention to unintended consequences and evolutionary processes. My work on The Fatal Conceit examined how these philosophical errors manifested in 20th century socialism and continue to influence contemporary policy debates. The tragic results of central planning in the Soviet Union, China, and other countries provide empirical validation of the theoretical arguments against constructivist rationalism. The philosophical lesson extends beyond economics to all areas of social policy. Whether addressing healthcare, education, environmental protection, or poverty, the temptation to replace evolved institutions with rational design creates predictable failures. Understanding the philosophical roots of this temptation provides the intellectual foundation for defending evolutionary approaches to social improvement. Chapter 5: Constitutional Philosophy and the Rule of Law. The philosophical foundation of a free society requires more than understanding markets and spontaneous order. It demands a constitutional framework that protects the conditions under which beneficial order can emerge. My work on constitutional economics represents an attempt to develop a philosophical approach to law and government that serves human flourishing rather than political power. The philosophical distinction between law and legislation proves crucial for understanding constitutional government. Law, properly understood, consists of general rules that apply equally to all individuals and evolve through judicial precedent to address particular disputes. Legislation represents specific commands issued by political authorities to achieve particular outcomes. The philosophical difference is fundamental. Law facilitates voluntary cooperation by providing stable expectations, while legislation directs behavior toward predetermined goals. The rule of law embodies a philosophical commitment to treating individuals as rational agents capable of planning their own lives. When legal rules are general, predictable, and equally applied, people can form reasonable expectations about the consequences of their actions. This enables long-term planning, voluntary cooperation, and peaceful dispute resolution. When government operates through specific commands rather than general rules, individuals become mere instruments of political will rather than autonomous agents. Constitutional philosophy must therefore focus on limiting government power rather than directing its use. The American constitutional tradition originally embodied this philosophical insight through enumerated powers, separation of functions, and protection of individual rights. These mechanisms aimed to prevent government from becoming an instrument of particular interests rather than a framework for general cooperation. The philosophical challenge of constitutional design involves creating institutions that channel self-interest toward public benefit. The founders understood that political actors, like economic actors, respond to incentives. Constitutional mechanisms must therefore structure political incentives to discourage abuse of power and encourage respect for individual rights. Federal systems embody important philosophical principles about political organization. By distributing power across multiple levels of government, federalism creates competition among jurisdictions and provides escape mechanisms for oppressive policies. This institutional diversity enables experimentation with different approaches to social problems while preventing any single authority from imposing uniform solutions. The philosophical foundation of constitutional government ultimately rests on recognition that political power tends to corrupt and that sustainable prosperity requires limiting that power through institutional constraints rather than relying on the good intentions of political leaders. My trilogy, Law, Legislation, and Liberty, developed these philosophical insights into a comprehensive theory of constitutional order. The work demonstrates how the philosophical principles of spontaneous order apply to legal and political institutions, showing why evolutionary processes produce better outcomes than rational construction in law as in economics. The contemporary relevance of constitutional philosophy becomes apparent when examining the expansion of administrative government and the erosion of constitutional constraints on political power. Understanding the philosophical foundations of constitutional order provides the intellectual tools necessary for defending and restoring limited government. Chapter 6: Individual Liberty as Social Philosophy. Individual liberty represents not merely a political preference but a philosophical prerequisite for social progress and human flourishing. My lifelong defense of freedom stems from understanding its essential role in the discovery processes that drive civilization forward. The philosophical case for individual liberty rests on epistemological foundations. Because knowledge is dispersed and constantly changing, social progress depends on freedom for individuals to experiment, innovate, and pursue their own insights. When government restricts individual choice to protect people from making wrong decisions, it simultaneously prevents the discoveries that emerge from voluntary experimentation. Consider the philosophical relationship between freedom and responsibility. Liberty means the right to choose, which necessarily includes the right to choose poorly. Without genuine consequences for decisions, individuals cannot learn from experience or develop practical wisdom. When government shields people from the results of their choices through subsidies, bailouts, and redistributive programs, it undermines the feedback mechanisms that teach responsible behavior. The philosophical connection between individual liberty and social coordination runs deeper than most people realize. Markets work precisely because they allow individuals to pursue their own goals while serving others' needs. This invisible hand mechanism depends on freedom. When government directs economic activity toward politically determined goals, it destroys the incentive alignment that makes voluntary cooperation beneficial for all parties. Individual liberty also serves crucial philosophical functions in protecting minority viewpoints and enabling social criticism. Progress often begins with unconventional ideas that challenge established orthodoxy. When government has power to suppress harmful speech or dangerous activities, it inevitably protects existing interests against innovative challenges. The marketplace of ideas, like the marketplace of goods, requires freedom for superior alternatives to emerge and displace inferior incumbents. The philosophical foundation of property rights proves essential for understanding liberty's social function. Private property creates incentives for productive use and careful stewardship of resources. It enables individuals to plan for the future and accumulate capital for investment. Most importantly, it provides the material foundation for independence from political authority. The philosophical challenge involves balancing individual freedom with social cooperation. Liberty does not mean license to harm others, but it does require accepting that people will make choices we consider unwise. The philosophical framework of negative rights, rights against interference rather than rights to particular goods, provides the conceptual foundation for this balance. My work in The Constitution of Liberty explored these philosophical themes in detail, demonstrating how individual freedom serves not only personal flourishing but social progress. The book shows how liberty enables the discovery processes that generate new knowledge, better institutions, and improved living standards for everyone. The philosophical defense of liberty must address the common objection that freedom leads to inequality and social division. But this criticism misunderstands the nature of social cooperation. In free societies, People prosper by serving others' needs, creating harmony between individual success and social benefit. The alternative, using political power to redistribute wealth, destroys the incentives for productive activity and replaces voluntary cooperation with coercive conflict. Understanding liberty as social philosophy provides the intellectual foundation for defending freedom against the constant pressures for government expansion and social control. Chapter 7: Applying Philosophical Insights to Contemporary Challenges. The philosophical principles underlying Austrian economics provide powerful tools for understanding contemporary challenges and evaluating proposed solutions. From cryptocurrency and digital markets to regulatory policy and international trade, philosophical clarity helps cut through political rhetoric to identify approaches that serve human flourishing. Consider the philosophical implications of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. These innovations represent spontaneous order in action, decentralized systems that coordinate behavior without central authority. Bitcoin emerges through voluntary adoption rather than government mandate, yet it provides monetary services that many national currencies cannot match. This validates the philosophical insight that beneficial order often emerges from freedom rather than design. The success of cryptocurrency also demonstrates the knowledge problem in monetary policy. Central banks attempt to manage money supply based on aggregated economic statistics, but they cannot access the dispersed knowledge about individual preferences and circumstances that determines the actual demand for money. Market-based monetary systems, by contrast, allow this information to emerge through voluntary exchange, creating more stable and responsive monetary arrangements. The philosophical framework of spontaneous order also illuminates the internet economy. Platforms like Amazon, Google, and Facebook emerged through market processes, not government planning, yet they coordinate economic activity on unprecedented scales. Their success demonstrates how voluntary cooperation can solve coordination problems that would overwhelm any central authority. Attempts to regulate these platforms based on traditional economic models often backfire because they ignore the evolutionary processes that made these innovations possible. Healthcare policy provides another arena where philosophical clarity proves essential. The knowledge problem explains why healthcare markets function poorly under extensive government regulation. The intimate personal knowledge required for medical decisions cannot be centralized in bureaucratic agencies. Price controls and mandated coverage destroy the discovery mechanisms that would otherwise coordinate supply and demand. The philosophical approach suggests removing regulatory barriers to innovation and voluntary insurance arrangements rather than expanding government control. Educational policy similarly benefits from philosophical analysis. The diversity of human talents and learning styles makes standardized educational approaches philosophically suspect. School choice programs embody spontaneous order principles by allowing educational approaches to evolve through competitive selection rather than administrative mandate. The philosophical foundation of individual liberty supports parental authority over children's education rather than state determination of curriculum and methods. International trade policy reflects philosophical assumptions about the nature of economic relationships. Protectionist policies assume that trade involves winners and losers rather than mutual benefit. The philosophical understanding of voluntary exchange reveals that both parties gain from trade, making restrictions harmful to both domestic consumers and foreign producers. Trade wars represent philosophical confusion about the nature of economic cooperation. Environmental policy challenges require sophisticated philosophical analysis. Market failures in environmental protection often result from poorly defined property rights rather than inherent flaws in voluntary cooperation. The philosophical approach emphasizes institutional solutions that create incentives for environmental stewardship rather than command and control regulation that ignores local knowledge and evolutionary adaptation. The philosophical framework provides guidance for evaluating any policy proposal. Does it respect the limits of human knowledge? Does it allow beneficial order to emerge? Does it protect individual liberty while enabling voluntary cooperation? These questions cut through political rhetoric to focus on fundamental principles that determine policy success or failure. Conclusion. The philosophical foundations of Austrian economics provide more than academic insights, they offer practical wisdom for navigating an increasingly complex world. Understanding the limits of human knowledge encourages epistemic humility in approaching social problems. Recognizing spontaneous order reveals how beneficial arrangements emerge from freedom rather than design. Appreciating the discovery function of markets shows why voluntary cooperation consistently outperforms coercive planning. These philosophical insights remain as relevant today as when I first developed them decades ago. New technologies create opportunities for spontaneous order through digital platforms and cryptocurrencies. Regulatory challenges require understanding the knowledge problem and respecting evolutionary processes. Political debates benefit from constitutional philosophy that limits government power while protecting individual liberty. The greatest philosophical lesson involves recognizing that human flourishing depends on humility about what we can know and respect for the wisdom embedded in voluntary institutions. Progress emerges through freedom, not control. Prosperity results from cooperation, not coercion. Understanding these philosophical truths provides the foundation for defending and extending the conditions that enable human beings to pursue their own vision of the good life while contributing to the common welfare through voluntary exchange. This philosophical framework offers hope for continuing progress through the eternal principles of freedom, responsibility, and voluntary cooperation that have made modern civilization possible.